probably a lot of you know, we have hosted Barbara here a number of times now. This has become a little bit of a kind of tradition of having her present materials from the archive. It's a tradition that we feel wonderful about, and you know, she always keeps things kind of mysterious, so we ourselves don't really know what we're necessarily going to be seeing. So I have that extra added excitement. I just want to tell you a couple things. Well, first of all, this is part of a series of events around town at Carnegie Hall. I mean, they didn't organize all the events, but they've kind of announced them all under the umbrella of the 60s, the years that changed America. I don't know if you've come across these around town, but they help kind of promote and draw various things under that umbrella. So thank you to Carnegie Hall. I just want to thank Barbara as always. Again, hopefully we can continue to do this for these lectures. The materials are always just utterly fascinating. And so, yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara. Please welcome Barbara Moore.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. This is quite an audience. I know so many people in it, so I'm very happy to have you here. And I certainly want to thank Anthology. They've always been wonderful to me, and Jed, who you just heard from, and Kobe, and John Klaxman, who isn't here now, and our great projectionist, Evelyn, who's up there. And also Andy Gurian, my good friend, is videotaping, and so he's been wonderful. Okay, so some of you may have seen Melissa Ratcliffe-Burt's exhibition at the Gray Art Gallery earlier or last year, Inventing Downtown, in which she traced some of the important groups and spaces where artists hung out in the 1950s and early 60s, creating a community that flowered. What I'm going to show you are some of the fruits of that flowering. As more spaces proliferated, new ideas were introduced, and more artists gravitated to the mostly downtown scene. In trying to show as many photographs and as many different aspects of that scene as I can, and I think you're all familiar with how vast Peter's archive is, so this is always an issue to try to get out new material. I'm going to minimize, because of this, I'm going to minimize certain subjects that you're all probably more familiar with, such as Fluxus, Judson Dance Theater, people like Nam June Paik and Charlotte Moorman, and Charlotte's 15 Avant-Garde festivals, all of which I've recently covered in depth or will be covering in the near future. For these well-known subjects, I'll show you just a few images, which will serve as markers in the following chronological presentation. Peter Moore started photographing avant-garde events in 1961, but we began to consider it as an ongoing project more or less in 1962. One of the first places we attended on a regular basis was Judson Memorial Church, and one of the most interesting of the many programs, both politically and culturally aware, that the church sponsored was the Hall of Issues, an ongoing forum organized by painter Phyllis Yampolsky. And that's Phyllis standing second from the right. The person against the wall, the man in the glasses, is David Heath, a photographer. And there are other people I can sometimes pick out of this and identify, but I can't see from here. The hall was exactly what its name describes. On Sundays, anyone could post anything about any issue on the wall of a room in the church basement, and on Wednesdays, the contents of the wall would be discussed. Discussion was loosely defined so that it might include even a performance, such as Peter Schumann's Totentanz or Death Dance. Schumann was a German sculptor who came to the United States in 1961. His Totentanz was a powerful expressionistic dance with music performed by 7 masked performers. The papier-mâché masks on the performers, on the human performers, the ritualistic form and raucous percussive music became hallmarks of Schumann's bread and puppet theater, which Peter Moore continued to document for the next 30 years. The first Judson Dance Theater performance Peter and I saw was Concert of Dance No. 4 in January 1963. I'm going to reference that with only one photograph here. As I told you before, I would just briefly touch on these things. This is from Tricia Brown's Lightfall with her and Steve Paxton. Peter's more iconic photograph of this dance that you may be thinking about shows Tricia sitting on Steve's back, but I've chosen this one because it shows the whole audience in the repurposed Judson Gym where the earliest dance theater performances took place. 4 days later, we were introduced to another choreographer working in a more flamboyant style. James Waring was not a participant in the workshop that spawned Judson Dance Theater, but his spirit was ever present. His company at that time included Valda Setterfield, David Gordon, Yvonne Rayner, Eileen Pasloff, Deborah Hay, and Arlene Rothlein, among others, all of them leading lights at Judson. Jimmy created both ballets and more experimental works, and one of his greatest virtues was an openness to everything everyone else was involved in. His eclectic interests introduced many of his students and colleagues to each other. Yvonne, here doing something funny with a ribbon that's unwinding from Valda, has said she learned a lot from him. And here is a group simultaneously dancing and blowing on party whistles that unfurl, you know, the kind you have in New Year's, in a piece called At Hallelujah Gardens. Among the most politically engaged artists at this time were Julian Beck and Judith Malina, founders of the Living Theater. Here they are discussing revolution at a place called the Center. And this is Julian, and this is Judith, and this is still 63. In the early 1960s, smaller, more personal art and art with populist subjects was being made in direct reaction against the macho aggressiveness of abstract expressionism. Similarly, Judson dancers discarded the histrionics of Martha Graham and other modern dancers in favor of lower-key quotidian movement. The avant-garde was, however, united more by what it was against than what it was for, and eventually schisms occurred. These images precede that. Everybody attended and participated in everyone else's performances. There was no New York Fluxus yet. That movement first surfaced with Americans in Europe in 1962-63. There were events in New York that might be considered proto-Fluxus, but with a broadly based pool of participants and audience. One such major event was the Yam Festival that took place throughout the month of May, and of course, Yam is May spelled backwards, May 1963. A weekend of Yam events took place at the Hardware Poets Playhouse, right here, so called because it was above a hardware store on West 54th Street. On May 11th, more than 24 hours of activities called Yam Day epitomized the eclectic overall nature of the festival. This is what a typical audience looked like. I show this as an indication not just of the general ambiance, but of the crossover attraction within the avant-garde community. Over on the right is Dick Higgins, the guy in the foreground there, most often associated with Fluxus. On the far left, wearing sunglasses, I think, yeah, you can see him over there, the end of the row. That's Andy Warhol, the quintessential pop artist who always skirted the dividing line between the establishment and the avant-garde. One of the most memorable performances from that weekend is Robin Page's solo for guitar. Now, what happened is that the whole audience went down the stairs of the playhouse, kicking the guitar, out onto the street, down the street towards MoMA. Remember, they were on West 54th, so they went over to 53rd Street. And at that time, even the Whitney was on 53rd Street. And then they went back to the Hardware Poets. A week later, the whole community traveled to George Siegel's farm in New Jersey for a splendid day of picnicking and art events. On the roof of a former chicken coop, Yvonne Rainer and Tricia Brown improvised. This is Wolf Fostel. He called his happenings and artworks day collages, that is, acts of reduction and mutation, in contrast with collages, which are constructed rather than taken apart. This is Fostel's television day collage, which he dressed the TV, and here it is as it was finished, and then it was hauled outside to be buried. And this is a reminder that before the video art, before the advent of the Portapak in 1965, consisted mostly of reconfiguring equipment or manipulating electronic programming in some way. Now we're still at Siegel's farm. This is Lamont Young and his group. And I'm pretty sure that's Tony Conrad on the left there in the dark jacket, playing a drone in the field of long grass. This is a close-up of Lamont. The mix of artistic sensibilities is epitomized in this grouping of Green Gallery director Dick Bellamy, abstract artist Miles Forst, pop artist Klaus Oldenburg, and minimalist Donald Judd. Since I am going to be covering Judson Dance Theater thoroughly later this year, I just want to make very clear that it's very much in context at this stage in the chronology. So here's Bob Morris in his performance Arizona on June 23rd, 1963 at Judson. One of the lesser-known venues for avant-garde performances was the Pocket Theater, a small proscenium theater that, like most of such off-the-radar spaces, lasted only a couple years with that identity. It later became a pornographic movie house. And I'll be showing things from performances there. This is Lamont and Marion again. And here's also from the Pocket. As was common, non-musicians such as Jimmy Waring, who's on the right, played instruments alongside of professionals such as Philip Corner, who's playing the trombone. Still at the Pocket, this is Judson dancer Freddie Herco with a hammer in Al Hansen's Happening, Alice Denham in 48 Seconds. And Freddie again performing George Brecht's comb music by combing his hair. Shortly thereafter, we went to the Green Gallery. This is James Lee Byers at the Green Gallery. And he and the woman working with him are rolling out one of his long scrolls on this platform of white boxes. And Yvonne Rainer described him as having a bird's egg head and the woman as having a real Balenciaga dress. Judson Dance Theater had, early on, attracted notice far from its downtown roots. On January 18, 1964, at Cordier Ekstrom Gallery on Upper Madison Avenue, in the building where Gagosian Gallery is today, as a matter of fact, Freddie Herco collaborated with his friend Joe Jones, a Fluxus artist known for creating delightful instruments such as the self-playing drum set pictured hanging from the ceiling here. in a piece called Dervish, in which Freddie whirled around so intensely that he virtually disappeared. A few days later, the aging composer Edgar Varese was belatedly, very belatedly recognized by New York's musical establishment at what was then Philharmonic and then became Avery Fisher, currently Geffen Hall at Lincoln Center. Shortly after this, Charlotte Moorman gave Varese his first one-person concert in the United States, and he died within a year. So it was all very belated recognition. Choreographer Elaine Summers, a pioneer in using film within her dances, showed in evening-length work Fantastic Gardens at Judson in February 1964. A series of Judson-related dance evenings, which took place at another venue on the Upper East Side, was called Surplus. And here's Lucinda Childs in Yvonne Rayner's Dialogues. And in March 1964, there were more eclectic performances back at the Pocket Theater. This is Steve Paxton in Rialto. Finally, in April '64, after 2 years of acclaim and controversy in Europe, Fluxus, which had originally been created by Americans, came to New York. Its first series of concerts, mostly weekly through April and May, took place in George Maciunas' loft on Canal Street, very different from what a living loft looks like today. The compact performance space shown here was about a third of the full loft layout. There was one section that was more of a living and storage space, and one part was the Flux shop where he sold multiples. To make this photograph, Peter had to pretty much stand against the back wall, so you can see how small it is. Once again, I'm not showing many of Peter's wonderful photographs on this subject, just a few touchstones for context, such as the premiere of Nam June Paik's Zen for Film, which is blank film leader that's projected so that it shows all the dust and scratches that would be on it. And I can't not show George Maciunas' performance of Nam June Paik's One for Violin solo, in which he very, very, very slowly raises the violin and smashes it down. 1964 began a period of hostility to Fluxus by most of the formerly accepting art world, partially due to what were considered strident Marxist declamations by Henry Flint and George Maciunas. When one looks back on it, the rhetoric that seemed so provocative back then, terms like cultural imperialism that I personally had never heard before, have mostly been accepted into our consciousness. This is Henry Flint and George and others picketing a Karlheinz Stockhausen concert. Beverly Schmidt, later known as Beverly Blossom, was another Judsonite who was innovative in incorporating film into her dances. Here she is performing at the 92nd Street Y in 1964. The Café Chino is mostly remembered as an important site in the history of off-Broadway theater, not dance. Here's Yvonne improvising with theater director Larry Lunan. Eileen Pasloff on top and Elaine Summers in a dance by Elaine. This was from a series of performances at the Washington Square Galleries, a large, and that's galleries plural, a large commercial, fairly conventional art gallery on what is now LaGuardia Place. October '64, Judith Dunn at Judson in one of her collaborations with the filmmaker Gene Friedman. Judith, along with Elaine Summers, Beverly Blossom, and Carolee Schneemann, these are four women who by incorporating film with live performance had a tremendous and not surprisingly largely uncredited role in the development of multimedia. Carolee's most famous work, the evening-length Meet Joy, has usually been lumped with happenings in art world kinds of the way the art world tends to pigeonhole things, but it was actually a presentation of Judson Dance Theater in which Carolee was an early participant and for which she created several other distinctive works. In the annals of alternative performance venues, it's impossible to ignore the Café Au Go-Go, a typical village club, Greenwich Village Club, among other things, gained quite a bit of fame as somewhat of a home base for Lenny Bruce, and I think that's where he was actually arrested. But on Monday nights, the Au Go-Go was dark, and there was little risk in giving the place over to the clearly uncommercial tastes of Fluxus artists George Brecht and Robert Watts. Thus was inaugurated the series Monday Night Letter, or Letters as it's sometimes printed. As time went on, the evenings under different titles were organized by other people, even screening the premiere of Warhol's film Harlot. This is Al Hansen in a happening at the Au Go-Go. This is Alison Knowles on the right serving Dick Higgins and with Robert Watts in the middle there. She's performing her proposition, Make a Soup. In recent years, and of course giving everybody soup. In recent years, that piece was made famous by the Make a Salad variation performed for 3,000 people in 2008 in the Tate Modern's Turbine Hall. And it's been performed as Make a Salad many times, I think, since in different countries. This is Nam June performing a piece by Allison. And this is Yvonne wearing a lead bra made by Robert Morris. This shows you how eclectic the mix of people was. A lead bra made by Robert Morris in a very elaborate all-star opera written and directed by Dick Higgins. And this is all at the Au Go-Go still. January 1965, at painter and filmmaker Al Leslie's loft on 23rd Street. He was screening one of his films, and Lucinda Childs premiered her piece, Geranium. In April 1965, a truly unusual site-specific location was appropriated by Dick Higgins for several of his short, non-Fluxus theatrical scripts. Dick wrote a huge amount of material that was mimeographed scripts and pieces that were not necessarily, they were very different quite often from Fluxus. So Sunnyside Garden was a wrestling arena in Queens. And this is Al Hansen and Meredith Monk in Dick's piece, Celestials, at Sunnyside. Choreographer dancer Jimmy Waring occasionally performed what he called lectures, sometimes in collaboration with his friend, the composer John Herbert McDowell. These were forerunners of the kind of object manipulations that were practiced in the 1980s by artists such as Stuart Sherman and Ralston Farina, just using a variety of all kinds of objects and doing funny and wonderful things with them. Here's one at the Bridge, which is a small theater that was on St. Mark's Place in the mid-1960s. And this picture, of course, gives everyone a very clear idea of where we are in the chronology and the way the work was being received at the time. This is the May 1965 performance of Rauschenberg's Pelican, which was at the first and only New York Theater Rally, a series that took place in an abandoned television studio on the Upper West Side. Fluxus cropped up again in a summer 1965 series at 85 East 4th Street, which was a short-lived site for Jonas Mekas' film activities. I can't remember if it was under the name of the Cinematheque or not. But it's also still in existence as I think Crane Bar was called KGB for a while as a performance space. So it's basically still there in one form or another at 85 East 4th. But this evening, when one artist canceled his performance, instead of notifying everyone, George Maciunas turned the occasion into a Fluxus event by blocking the entrance to the theater with large weather balloons. I guess people got the message if they showed up. Okay, now this piece is called Without and Within, and it's by Ken Dewey from June 8th, 1965, at the Palm Gardens, which was a nightclub sort of a place in the West 40s. Ken is somebody very dear to my heart and to many people in our circle. He was an underknown creator of happenings and theater works who straddled the divide between artists and government bureaucracy by having an official position at the New York State Council on the Arts, where he was influential in creating new artist-centered programs, such as the one for video art. Ken died in 1972 at a very early age, and that's a large reason why so much of his work has been underknown. In this piece, Without and Within, it had political overtones, which don't show in the pictures I'm showing you actually, but the background is that on March 7th of that year, the police in Selma had attacked the civil rights marchers, and 2 weeks later, Ken was one of thousands of people from around the country who went to Selma to march on the Montgomery State Capitol. Without and Within was a happening with references to the civil rights struggle and Vietnam. It was subtitled An Action Theater Event to mark the passing of Confederate Memorial Day, which, how we wish that had happened. So this is one of the figures. There's many, many photographs, obviously, of many parts of the performances. It was divided into 3 parts, the last of which was called Motion, and was an audience participation section with a tug of war that started as a straightforward game, morphed into a ritual, and finally an ecstatic dance. This is a young Jill Clayburgh before she became a well-known actress in that final section, and a very young Robert De Niro was also in this production. Warhol was a pervasive presence, as we all know, throughout the 60s, and every photographer had their Warhol moment. This is one of Peter's. It's a screening at Warhol's factory, the original factory. And it was supposed to be Marie Menken's new film, and that's Marie Menken on the right there. But there was something that went wrong, and you might get that out of this photograph also. So Warhol ended up showing some films of his own. In the summer of 1965, there was a small series of weekend performances in a very, very out-of-the-way place, Upper Black Eddy, Pennsylvania. And the series was called Sundance, which had absolutely no relationship to the film festival in Utah, which didn't exist back in those days at all. This is Merce that was there one of the weekends, and this is John Cage performing 0 minutes, 00 seconds, which is a piece where he attaches a contact microphone to his neck or throat, and he drinks a glass of water, lights a cigarette, and you get the sounds. August 21st, 1965, Alan Capro's piece titled Calling. Now, this is Jean-Claude, the Jean-Claude who was married to Christo and collaborated with Christo. And she's being wrapped in aluminum foil. The instructions say that the car, she's left alone in the car, all wrapped up, and it's left someplace, parked someplace and left. And it's locked, and people are coming to look at it, of course. And then, now there were 3 groups doing this, and Peter was only following one of them, the one with Jean-Claude. So the silver person would then be unwrapped and rewrapped in cloth and left someplace else. And here is Jean-Claude in a garage, obviously. And then she would be picked up by another car, taken to Grand Central Station, and deposited at the information booth along with the other wrapped participants. And you can't imagine even trying to get these things done today. And of course, I doubt that Capro got permission. Yoko Ono's morning piece on a rooftop on Christopher Street. She is selling sea-washed shards of glass that would have washed up on a beach, and she labels each of them with a different morning. A few days later, we were off to Ann Arbor, Michigan for the 3-day Once Again festival. Once again, because there'd already been a Once festival that year, organized by the interdisciplinary Intermedia Once group of musicians, filmmakers, and visual artists, among them Gordon Mumma, Robert Ashley, Mary Ashley, Milton Cohn, Joseph Werer, and Ann Werer. Performances were in the open air on the roof of a parking garage. The first evening was the group's performance called Unmarked Interchange, in which various activities took place in the doorways and drawer-like protrusions that had been cut into a large white structure. Now, this is the structure, obviously, before the action was taking place, just to give you an idea. This is during the performance, showing you this space, the open air space, the large open air. And now you can start to see these various interferences in that screen, which is showing Fred and Ginger in top hat projected over the entire scene. And here's another view from that. The next night was Judson Night, with Steve Paxton's Earth Interior and Robert Rauschenberg's Spring Training. Now that's Bob, obviously, on the right, that's Lucinda on the left, and those 2 specks of light on the ground are flashlights on the backs of turtles. And this was the grand finale with all the turtles. There were many, many turtles. Back in New York, there were still weekly events at the Cafe Au Go-Go. And just for reference in time here, this is Charlotte Moorman and Nam June Paik on October 4th, 1965, performing what they refer to as the human cello, one sequence in their version of John Cage's 26 minutes, 1.1499 seconds for a string player. In November and December 1965, One of the most influential art events of the 1960s took place at the Filmmakers Cinematheque. The New Cinema Festival, more commonly known as the Expanded Cinema Festival, had a different program exploring a wide range of projected media and performances using light almost every night. One night would be a psychedelic media bombardment by Usco, another a real-time film by Andy Warhol, or a happening by Klaus Oldenburg. This is Beverly Schmidt Blossom again, and collaborating with Roberts Blossom, her husband, and he became a well-known actor in Hollywood. You still see a lot of his movies around. But in those days, he was working usually with Beverly on this thing he called Film Stage, which was expressly dedicated to the uses of film in theatrical works. Nam June in the expanded version with a performance of his Zen for Film. Carolee Schneemann and Phoebe Neville in Ghost Rev, which was a collaboration with the multimedia group Usco. And this is Carolee in that piece, Ghost Rev. Ken Dewey collaborated with Terry Riley on a piece called Sames, in which film was sprayed all over the auditorium. And these are pretty well known. This is Bob Whitman's Prune Flat with Simone Forti on the left and Lucinda Childs on the right. And there's a sequence here, as you'll see. And another piece that is somewhat familiar, Rauschenberg's Map Room 2, that's Alex Hay on the left and Steve Paxton. Deborah Hay wearing a birdcage. And this is Bob, and that's Deborah on the couch. Bob has that streak of light he's carrying. It was a wireless strip of light, basically, or I don't know what you'd call it, and the shoes were made by Armand. Meanwhile, there were other events taking place simultaneously with that festival. On November 26, 1965, Yvonne gave a private performance at the request of filmmaker Ed Emshwiller, who was making a film for the U.S. Information Agency. And just as a side note on that, for years I begged Ed to show us the film, and I do think there was some kind of contractual obligation that he wasn't allowed to show it in the United States. We gradually had realized that the USIA was the propaganda arm for the United States, and since it was the Vietnam War, a lot of us started to look down on it, and they didn't allow their stuff to be shown in the United States. It was for overseas consumption, basically. And I think Ed may have had misgivings about it. It was also maybe for him a commercial job that he was just hired to do. And he, would never screen it, even if he may not have even had a copy. I don't know. Now, this untitled dance is clearly what came to be called Trio A, the groundbreaking choreography that was first publicly performed a month and a half later, but it was untitled at the time she did it here. This photograph is of, not by, Peter. It's by Peter's brother, Christopher. Peter is shooting a flux film of Yoko Ono in our quirky one-bedroom apartment on East 36th Street in January 1966. We had inherited the entranceways, Indian fabric-covered walls, and checkerboard floor from the previous tenant. In March of 1966 at the Judson Gallery, an installation by Tony Cox, Yoko Ono, those are her bags, and Jeff Perkins, who did the projections. It was called The Stone. Kusama's first mirrored infinity room in March 1966. By this time, the original members of Judson Dance Theater had mostly gone on to other things and other places. New dancers, who I came to think of as second-generation Judson, appeared on the scene. The most prominent of these were Kenneth King, here with performing with Laura Dean, and Phoebe Neville, and also Meredith Monk, and this is Meredith when she was still, at least publicly, exclusively a dancer. During the summer of 1966, Alan Capro organized small local events called Self-Service that took place in 3 cities, New York, Los Angeles, and Boston. Each venue had a different choice of activities and a different schedule. One of the New York options was, in Alan's words, on the shoulder of a stretch of highway, a fancy banquet table laid out, food in the plates, money in the saucers, everything left there. And that's what we did. We drove out to New Jersey. That was the highway. We set up this table, and we left it there. In June of 1966, there was a performance of Eric Satie's Vexations at the Something Else Gallery, which was Dick Higgins' house in Chelsea. Within the past year or two, there was a performance of Vexations. The first performance had been in 1963 at one of those series at the Pocket Theater. The first performance in the world ever from, the time Eric Satie had written the piece. It was sort of a discouraging piece to have to perform. It's a brief piano phrase that is supposed to be repeated 840 times. And so this is Jackson McLough, a poet. Of course, there were non-musicians, of course, for all these things. This is Jackson playing in the relay team. This is the counter for the number of repetitions. Some of the audience that stayed. Actually, it was a concert of Satie's works that had started actually at 5:30 on a Saturday evening. And only at midnight did the relay team of pianists start playing Vexations, so then it lasted till 6 o'clock the next day. Now, while this was going on, Max Neuhaus set up in the Higgins bathroom nearby in a simultaneous event that he called Byproduct. Max was recording the entire performance of Vexations, and as he did it, he was using, of course, tape in those days, reel-to-reel tape, and as he recorded, he cut up the tape into small loops of sounds extracted from the concert, and he packaged them in little cans as a multiple, and you could take one away with you. And this is what the multiples looked like. Judith Dunn and Bill Dixon performed at Charlotte Moorman's 4th Annual New York Avant-Garde Festival in Central Park, the first time one of her festivals took place outside a regular concert hall, thus foreshadowing the abundant cultural uses of New York's public spaces that were to come. This is Merce Cunningham and Carolyn Brown in Night Wandering. I believe that's at Hunter College. Over a 3-day weekend in August 1966, Alan Capro, in collaboration with sculptor Charles Fraser, Gordon Hyatt, and Mordecai Gerstein, organized an extravagant happening gas throughout the Hamptons over 3 days. This is Capro leading a Southampton parade as the Neutron Kid, floating on a hovercraft by Charles Fraser. Next morning, nurses greeted a ferry boat and then appeared gesticulating on beds on the highway. And that afternoon, firefighting foam cascaded down the Montauk Bluffs, meeting the foam of the sea. Another group of performances that have achieved mythic status occurred in October '66, 9 evenings theater and engineering at the 69th Regiment Armory over on 26th Street. As a marker here, I'll only show one photograph of the hundreds Peter shot in black and white and color. This is Alex Hayes' grass field, and that's Robert Rauschenberg on the right. Throughout the early 1960s, there was controversy within various art communities as to how much politics should be part of the artworks themselves. For some, such as the guerrilla art action group Julian Beck and Judith Molina's Living Theater, Peter Schumann's Bread and Puppet Theater, Henry Flint's Picketing, and poet Jackson McLow's Humanistic Anarchism, political expression was always a vital component of their artistic practice. Other artists were politically concerned, but still relegated their art and social issues into separate spheres. By the late 1960s, as the Vietnam War escalated, all that changed. The Tet Offensive of 1968, in which the United States and South Vietnam forces suffered tremendous losses, and the Ohio National Guard shootings that killed 4 students in an anti-war protest at Kent State in 1970 were among the incidents that mobilized artists. One work that, for me, interestingly illustrates this progression is Yvonne's Trio A, which had been rigorously choreographed to be a steady pulse of totally uninflected, unemotional movement. Here it is on a multi-performer dance program during the protest week called Angry Arts Against the War in Vietnam, February 2nd, 1967. It's still its same self, basically, although there's a little story behind it that I don't feel is relevant to expand on. But 4 years later, on November 9th, 1970, Trio A, without losing its insistent, uninflected pulse, was dramatically transformed into Trio A with Flags for the opening of the People's Flag Show at Judson Memorial Church. Now, that was out of the chronology. Now I'm back in the chronology. Simone Forti, Yvonne Rainer, and other dancers active in New York had studied with and been greatly influenced by Anna Halprin in California in the late 1950s and early 60s. Halprin finally came east to perform in April 1967, first in Hartford at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, seen here, then in New York. Trisha Brown, Skunk Cabbage, Saltgrass, and Waiters in photographer Bert Stern's studio, May 1967. Peter and I had been hearing about Simone Forti and her dance constructions from the time we began attending performances. But Simone had early on stopped performing her own work, appearing only in others' works, such as those by her then husband, Robert Whitman, and you saw the light bulb sequence that I showed previously. And then she was only in one Judson Dance Theater performance, a piece by Trisha Brown. It's the only one I've been able to find. November 10th, 1967 marked her return to performing her own work at the School of Visual Arts Amphitheater. Slantboard is a wooden ramp. It's about 8 feet square, and there's knotted ropes on it that allow the performers to maneuver around the slanted 45-degree angle. That's Steve Paxton next to her. A few days later, something entirely different again. The Made with Paper exhibition opened at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts down the street from MoMA. The museum is now called the Museum of Arts and Design and is at Columbus Circle. For the opening, James Lee Byers created a gigantic figure in the street made out of a paper called Dissolvo. That's Dissolvo. And that's exactly what it did. Sanitation trucks started spraying as they went down the street, and the piece disappeared. This is Rémi Charlotte in his piece Meditation, and it's one of Peter's few studio photographs taken in December of 1967. The USCO Group's Tabernacle in Garnetville, New York, pictured our members Gert Stern and Michael Callahan. On March 22nd, 1968, there was a preview for a planned series of events called the Destruction in Art Symposium, or DIAS, at the Judson Gallery. Ultimately, only the preview took place. Everything else was canceled after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th. However, this March 22nd is a good example of what Peter and I often faced in choosing what performances to attend. The DIAS preview, which ran from 7 to 9 p.m., included several actions that were duly documented before we went to St. Peter's Church on West 20th Street for a 9 o'clock performance of Steve Paxton's Satisfying Lover, which was two events in one night. The first concert of Phil Glass's own work at 80 Worcester Street, April 19th, 1968. Phil and Steve Reich are playing two pianos when they still worked together, obviously. June 12th, 1968. This is in its original version with Judd Yalcott's film. For many years afterwards, it was performed on a plain white background, but in recent years, the film has been reunited with it. This was the first of Brown's equipment pieces in which dancers work against gravity with the aid of a structure or support system, which is the equipment, that allows them to give the illusion that gravity doesn't exist. 3 performers here, Brown, Simone Forti, and Michelle Friedman, move along the surface of a vertical peg-like wall. Their costumes are black on one side, white on the other, so that sometimes they become part of the projected images, sometimes are silhouetted against them. The fashion show poetry event was at the Center for Inter-American Relations, which is now the Americas Society, still existing that way, at Park Avenue and 68th Street, January 14th, 1969. It was pop art presented as a real fashion show organized by the poets Jean Perrault, Eduardo Costa, and Hannah Wiener, who wrote arch and mocking commentary to accompany the close. This is Gerard Malanga wearing a stainless steel female suit of armor by Warhol. The ultimate pop solution to the question, is life a drag? Perfect for the rough chic. Deborah Hay modeling Marjorie Strider's Frame Your Own Frame dress. Carolee Schneemann in a white blindfold and white heels as conceived by Klaus Oldenburg, who said the poets will provide her clothes. And James Lee Byers, The World's Biggest Hat, which was for the audience to participate in. Mimi Gerard was a good friend of ours, married to the kinetic artist James Seawright, and they collaborated a lot on wonderful theater pieces, very much out of the Judson circle, She had come out of the Henry Street settlement and was associated with Alwyn Nicolai. I don't know if she performed with him, but she may have studied with him. And it was a separate branch of dance that actually Beverly Schmidt had been involved with also. Peter, who for many years earned his living by photographing paintings and sculpture, photographed the Whitney Museum's landmark anti-illusion procedures materials exhibition for the museum in May 1969. This is Raphael Ferrer's ice installation being installed. This is at the Breuer Building, obviously, and this is the actual installation. In conjunction with that exhibition, the Whitney presented several concerts. This is one by Phil Glass, and a week later there was one by Steve Reich. Forrest, more informally known as Frosty Myers, made a light sculpture in Central Park on July 20th, 1969, the night of the first moon landing of Apollo 11. Beginning in the summer of 1968, a group that included poets John Perrault, Hannah Wiener, Bernadette Mayer, Vito Conchi, and the sculptors Marjorie Strider and Scott Burton met daily in Perrault's loft, resulting in Streetworks, a series of events at the intersection of art, poetry, dance, happenings, and other performance genres and media. This is Scott Burton's performance at the opening of Streetworks 4 at the Architectural League on East 65th Street. It's October 2nd, 1969, and the performance was for him to sleep. And he later gave a name to this piece. It was either Dreaming or Dreams, something like that. But at that point, I don't believe it had a name. And this is Marjorie Strider's framed entrance to the Architectural League. This is a Deborah Hay piece danced in Damrosch Park at Lincoln Center in 1969. The park, of course, has been reconfigured. It was very much more wide open then. From the mid to the late 1960s, Meredith Monk transitioned from being purely a dancer choreographer to including music, and then to creating spectacular, site-specific multimedia works, of which Juice was one of the best. It was in 3 parts, each using the same elements reconfigured to be specific to the change in environment. Juice Part 1 was at the Guggenheim Museum on November 7th, 1969, during a Roy Lichtenstein retrospective. Juice Part 2 was 3 weeks later at the Macmillan Theater, Columbia University. 4 red figures who had appeared on the Guggenheim's ramps now appeared on a proscenium stage. In Part 3, the action was reduced to a video of the previous performance, the costumes and props strewn about Meredith's loft. George Maciunas often hosted eagerly awaited New Year's Eve dinners at 80 Worcester Street that were replete with a potluck of abundant themed foods and performances. For the one on December 31st, 1969, he made an American flag out of red, white, and blue-tipped wood matchsticks in memoriam to Richard Maxfield, the seminal electronic composer who had died that year. George lit the flag and that was how we ended the decade. I wanted to end with that piece, but was unable to have slides made. So I have two of Peter's original prints that you can see on your way out, and they're going to be on a stand near the doorway. Thank you.